Good morning and welcome to the new school. I'm excited to see all of you here and very pleased to see such a great mix of people from different parts of the nonprofit world and government and education. I'm Andrew White. I direct the Center for New York City Affairs, which is an applied policy research institute based at the Milano School of International Affairs, Management, and Urban Policy. The center seeks to drive innovation in social policy and improve the effectiveness of government and its partner organizations in working with low-income families and neighborhoods in New York. And we always are trying to find policy solutions in practice, so what's going on out in neighborhoods and in organizations, and lift that up and show it to you all and to the policymakers in government. As far as the Milano School goes, this is the important business of all of this. Anyone here thinking about pursuing a master's degree to advance your career in government or the nonprofit sector, I encourage you to consider the Milano School. We offer degrees in urban policy, nonprofit management, organizational change, environmental policy and sustainability management, and international affairs, and we are progressive and rigorous, and we're passionate about social justice in New York City and the world, and our programs are oriented around working in the field, learning the theory, and then applying it. And if any of you have questions about that, please get in touch with me. I'm happy to talk to you about our programs. So a little background about today's event, and then we'll get right into it. Like just about anyone else, every single day I wonder how in the world people turn out the way we do. I read the news in the morning, walk to work, deal with university colleagues, and I often wonder how come there are so many bonkers people out there. You know, what explains the actions of the anarchists in the Republican Party in DC, for example? Or are they just toddlers? That's what some of the better blog posts are saying. Or, you know, just more simple things. You see aggravated people on the street blowing up for no particular reason. A taxi cab going off duty. I saw it just this morning. A cab off duty wouldn't take a woman to work, and she berated him viciously. So much human behavior seems inexplicable. One of my former colleagues, she might even be here, has a habit of saying, "Remember, people are insane." And it's become her credo, and I think she's probably right. Human behavior is complicated. When it comes to social policy and practice with children and families, all of us have experiences of parents who behave badly, or teens who behave badly, or judges and lawyers and caseworkers and social workers and teachers who behave badly. But when it comes to parents, we strive, we set up these systems, we strive to find ways to change addictive behavior. We try to deal with debilitating depression or explosive anger, all of which have extreme consequences for families. And then we build these big government-funded systems to keep neighborhoods safe and to help people find decent jobs and live in decent apartments and put food on the table and get counseling if they need it and keep their kids in school and healthy and out of trouble. And all of that's great. And I think, you know, a lot of us are doing that work. It's a lot of work. New York is pretty good at it and has a good sense of what to do. And then all of a sudden, along into our vision comes this seemingly narrow scientific discipline of neuroscience and the development of the human brain. And the science of child brain development turns out to be incredibly illuminating and consequential. It takes us to a whole new level of understanding about the consequences of poverty and chronic stress and trauma on the developing child. And it also, I think, helps us make sense of the long-term consequences of actions taken by parents and by foster parents and by child care workers and social workers and pediatricians and so on. Pretty much everyone in these complex systems I was talking about before. Best of all, I think it helps us create a new frame around the work and to sell it to others. I've found that one of the most compelling points from the science is this: a small child may experience chronic stress and even major trauma, but if they have a responsive, nurturing, solid adult in their lives, they are much more likely to be resilient and get through it all right. This comes in part from the work of our keynote speaker today, Dr. Jack Shonkoff and his colleagues, and I'll introduce him in just a minute. But first I want to set up a little New York context for his talk and for the discussion that'll follow. This is the cover of the report that we just handed out. In this new edition of Child Welfare Watch, which is a project we began in 1997, I believe, we talk about what it means to be a solid, nurturing parent, especially when a small child and her family are struggling. And we describe the pockets of innovative work in mental health and social services, the pockets of the organizations who are using these strategies to make a big difference in people's lives. To some degree, parenting is common sense, at least for those who were lucky enough to have strong parents when we were kids. But the developmental science that we'll hear about from Dr. Shonkoff and the related work in behavioral psych help policymakers and providers build the framework around effective practice. It's relevant not only in mental health and child welfare, but in early education and youth development, and more broadly in how we think about government's role in working with families and neighborhoods. This issue of the Watch describes how parents and caregivers learn to do the right thing if they aren't already aware, and how parents, even as they deal with trauma and stress and poverty, struggle to raise infants and get the right kind of help. That's not always available in New York. I mean, one of the things we found is that the resources are pretty limited. It's not systemic. It is, in fact, just pockets of really interesting, good work going on. There's still a large gap between what we know from the science and what is actually happening on the ground in most of the city. So much of what we did in that report is look at the sort of fascinating elements of work that are happening in various organizations, some of which you will hear from on the panel today. We also offer a set of recommendations for government agencies that were developed with our advisory board. The Child Welfare Watch Advisory Board works with the staff to come up with these ideas and circulates them among themselves, redrafts them many times, and sends them to the government agencies to get their feedback, and they're in the front of the book. In foster care, the total number of children entering care has declined, as we all know, over the last 20 years, and especially over the last decade. But as this slide on the left shows, the number of small children in care has declined much less steeply than the older kids. This is in part because babies stay in care longer and they're more vulnerable, and small children are also more likely to land on the adoption track, which takes more time. But the important point right now is to understand that there are ways to intervene most effectively at these very early stages in a child's life. In child welfare, it's one of the places where this matters a lot. We see evidence of agencies that are beginning to change the ways in which they work with these infants and their parents and their foster parents, but there's still a very long way to go. This edition of Child Welfare Watch was written primarily by Abigail Kramer and Kendra Hurley. Kendra isn't here today because she's on maternity leave, fittingly having given birth to her daughter Iris the very day we sent the report to the printer. The report was made possible thanks to the support of a number of funders, including the Ira W. DeCamp Foundation, the Viola W. Bernard Foundation, the Child Welfare Fund, and the Sirus Fund, and related projects are supported by the Pinkerton Foundation and the Prospect Hill Foundation. We hope today's presentations and discussion will help carry us all a little bit further down the road of understanding how to do this work well, even as New York prepares for major changes at City Hall. All of that will be part of the discussion when we get to the panel. We're also going to take questions from you all on note cards or pieces of paper that will be collected and brought down to the front. So I'd like to introduce our speaker. Jack Shonkoff is one of the preeminent speakers, preeminent scientists and professors working on chronic stress and poverty and its impact on the human brain. He's the director of the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard University and professor of child health and development at the Harvard School of Public Health and the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And he's also professor of pediatrics at Harvard Medical School and Boston Children's Hospital. Dr. Shonkoff.
Thanks, Andrew, and congratulations. I think I ought to start with congratulations to everybody in the audience for all the work that you're doing. Have to say, I have deep roots in New York. I grew up in Brooklyn, and I'm a product of the New York City public schools, and I went It gets better. I got my medical degree at NYU and lived in Manhattan for 4 years. I did my residency in the Bronx and lived there for 3 years, and then I'm sorry I left. But I love coming back and visiting. So just as a kind of a frame for this, I think what I'm really going to be doing this morning is just really reviewing the science that explains why everything that you're doing is so important. So I'm not really sure how much you're going to learn that's new, because I think you already know this, but I'm really looking forward to the panel discussion and the conversation with the audience, because there's obviously a lot of important work to do. So, excuse me, let me start by using this notion of protecting the developing brain in early childhood as an important focal point for our conversation this morning, and saying that it's really not just a good slogan, it's not just a good advocacy position to say that a thriving and successful and prosperous society depends on this, because we really are living through a revolution in biology right now, not just neuroscience, but genomics, really molecular biology, understanding at the level of molecules, why and how experience affects development and also affects other aspects of health. And until a couple of years ago, I think a lot of us who were trying to figure out how science could be useful in the policy and practice arena, we're very much focused on using the science, as many of you do, to make the case for why intervening, and it's certainly in a preventive way, early in life is so important. But in the last couple of years, what we've been doing is it's not that job is over, but there's an even more interesting job, I think, which is to use the science to figure out how to be better about what we do, and not just make the case for getting as much support as possible for the things that we've been doing, some of them for decades, but as Andrew mentioned, in pockets, but not really spread out everywhere. So it is really true, and for the first part of my presentation, I'm going to just very quickly go through a lot of the science with you, and then the second part give you a little bit of a window into how we're thinking about using the science to ask the question and try to answer the question of what are we going to be doing 10 years from now, 20 years from now, and not just arguing about the same old things, because this really is about all of the problems that New York and the country and the world face when there are problems, whether it's inadequate educational achievement or poor economic productivity or poor health or lack of responsible citizenship and parenting of the next generation, which all of you know so well. So this is not just about how young children who are in vulnerable circumstances are going to be as adults, but how are they going to be as parents for the next generation, so we're not just having to do the same thing over and over again. So I'm going to show you a couple of brief videos that each of which took a long time to produce. This one, each of these took over a year to produce because we didn't want to just make them engaging, but they had to be scientifically accurate. So these videos went through a tougher peer review process than a lot of journal articles did, because scientists we work with demanded that we get it right. So even one thing got held up because somebody said, we thought we finished that neuron is upside down, so we had to kind of change that, not that any of you would notice. So the first video I'm going to show you is really the underlying neurobiology of what all of you understand so well, which is the importance of this interaction between young children and the adults who take care of them.
The key to forming strong brain architecture is what's known as serve and return interaction with adults. In this developmental game, new neural connections form in the brain as young children instinctively serve through babbling, facial expressions, and gestures. And adults return the serve, responding in a very directed, meaningful way. It starts very early in life, when a baby coos and the adult interacts and directs the baby's attention to a face or hand. This interaction forms the foundation of brain architecture upon which all future development will be built. It helps create neural connections between all the different areas of the brain, building the emotional and cognitive skills children need in life. For example, here's how it works for literacy and language skills. When the baby sees an object, the adult says its name. This makes connections in the baby's brain between particular sounds and their corresponding objects. Later, adults show young children that those objects and sounds can also be represented by marks on a page. With continued support from adults, children then learn how to decipher writing and eventually to write themselves. Each stage builds on what came before. Ensuring that children have adult caregivers who consistently engage in serve-and-return interaction, beginning in infancy, builds a foundation in the brain for all the learning, behavior, and health that follow.
So this video and several others are on our website, and you can just download them and use them if they have any useful purpose in any work that you're doing. The essential message here is that this back and forth serve and return interaction, what the developmental scientists call contingent reciprocity. That's why we call it serve and return. You can't really go to the legislator and talk about contingent reciprocity. So, but the brain biologically is expecting that, it's needing that, because humans are so helpless for such a long period of time, and when that doesn't happen, it signals danger and sets up all kinds of biological responses that I'll talk about in a second. So that's the end of your 90-second course in normal brain development. And now I want to talk a little bit about what happens when things go wrong, particularly when children are in circumstances of a real pile-up of adversity. So these data are taken, which I'll show you in a second, are taken from a national study of children in the child welfare system across the country. So all of the children, about 1,100 in this study, were all in an active Child Protective Service case. And the question for the study is, in addition to child abuse or neglect, how does the impact of additional risk factors affect a child's performance on a developmental test at age 3 years? And so it's the usual list of risk factors: limited parent education, low income, a mental health problem in the family, particularly depression, that we'll talk about in a couple of minutes, substance abuse, all of these things that are associated with a greater risk for problems later. And the findings in this study replicated the findings of just about every study that's ever been done about the association between risk and some outcome, is that 1 or 2 risk factors is not enough to undo you. We're not that fragile, but when you start to get a pileup of risk factors, in this case, by the time you get to 6 or 7 risk factors, essentially 90 to 100% of all the children are failing a developmental test by age 3, which in almost all states makes you eligible, even under the delay category, for federally entitled special education early intervention services. It means you're on your way to trouble in school. This is preventable. Children are not born this way. And most important, it's not just problems with emotional and social development. It's problems in language development. It's problems in cognitive development. It's across the board. So one way to look at this from a biological point of view is to say, well, a developmental test is to the brain as a urine analysis is to the kidney. It tells you how that organ is working. So we know that the pileup of adversity is affecting brain development. But of course, your grandmother could have told you that. And that's the other good thing about some of this science is when you get science converging with what your grandmother could have told you, you're really in a great position to say, we've got something cooking here that we should start paying attention to. So now we're going to switch to what science tells us about how adversity undermines brain development and produces what we call toxic stress.
Learning to deal with stress is an important part of healthy development. When experiencing stress, the stress response system is activated. The body and brain go on alert. There's an adrenaline rush, increased heart rate, and an increase in stress hormone levels. When the stress is relieved after a short time, or a young child receives support from caring adults, the stress response winds down and the body quickly returns to normal. In severe situations, such as ongoing abuse and neglect, where there is no caring adult to act as a buffer against the stress response stays activated. Even when there is no apparent physical harm, the extended absence of response from adults can activate the stress response system. Constant activation of the stress response overloads developing systems, with serious, lifelong consequences for the child. This is known as toxic stress. Over time, this results in a stress response system set permanently on high alert. In the areas of the brain dedicated to learning and reasoning, the neural connections that comprise brain architecture are weaker and fewer in number. Science shows that the prolonged activation of stress hormones in early childhood can actually reduce neural connections in these important areas of the brain at just the time when they should be growing new ones. Toxic stress can be avoided if we ensure that the environments in which children grow and develop are nurturing, stable, and engaging.
So let me just say one thing before I go on, in case any of you might be leaving in the next 5 minutes. I don't want anybody to walk out of here listening to this video and thinking that toxic stress and the experience of that in early infancy or early childhood means that you are doomed to a life of disrupted brain function. It doesn't mean that at all. It means that you now are dealing with a greater probability of problems later on. You're dealing with a greater burden of some disruption of early circuitry, but it is terribly wrong and scientifically inaccurate for people to take these findings and say, well, now we have children who are permanently damaged and there's nothing that we can do. It's absolutely not true, but it is absolutely true that the longer we wait, the harder it is to make things better, and the less good the outcome will be than it would have been if we had gotten things right the first time. So this is not purely deterministic. It's a probability, but it's a heavy probability. So now, having said that, now I'm going to lay this on even further, because what we're talking about are things that happen in the body, how adversity and experience, both positive and negative experience, gets built in to the body. And it just kind of sets you on a different trajectory. So there have been loads of studies. Many of you are familiar with the adverse childhood experiences study about how the pileup of adversity leads to later likelihood for greater risk for depression, greater risk for substance abuse problems. And this is another one where the wise guys will tell you, how many of my tax dollars did you spend to study that individuals who grow up with tremendous pressures in their lives, with violence and poverty, are more likely to abuse drugs than someone who grows up in a home where there are no problems? But the fact of that is that it's not just about depression and anxiety disorders and substance abuse and alcoholism. It's also about physical health. So these data are taken from a study in Dunedin, New Zealand, a small city on the other side of the world, that began a birth cohort study, which means that in a given year, every pregnant woman in the city was kind of enrolled in a study on a very high rate of positive response. And data were collected during the pregnancy, and then after the baby was born, a lot of information was collected over the years, developmental information, health information, so it's all accurate, collected at that time. These are data from the 32-year follow-up in this study, looking at the level in the blood of something called C-reactive protein, which is a marker of inflammation that's associated with a higher risk for heart disease. So think of it as an elevated cholesterol level. This is something that's been shown in many studies to show increased risk for heart disease. It doesn't mean you have heart disease, it means you're at greater risk. It's also elevated in individuals who have depression. So in this population, which was now about 1,200 people at age 32 who'd been followed since before they were born, about 15% of the healthy 32-year-olds with no medical problems and an uneventful early life history had elevated C-reactive proteins, which probably means some normal variant or some genetic predisposition for risk for heart disease. A higher percentage, about 25%, with clinical depression had elevated C-reactive proteins, and that just confirmed what had been shown in many studies before, that there is an inflammatory component to depression. But here was a new finding, maybe the first or second time it had been reported. It's been replicated a lot since. 32-year-olds who had a documented history of having been maltreated as young children had over 30% of them had elevated C-reactive proteins, and 32-year-olds who had a history of maltreatment and depression at age 32, almost 40% had elevated C-reactive proteins. Now, from a science point of view, what this means is this one study, well, who knows what it means? It's one study, right? But there are a number of studies now, so there's a body of knowledge accumulating to say that there is evidence that when maltreatment occurs early in life, whether you consciously remember it or not, the body remembers. There are biological memories. There are physiological changes that occur that could last into adulthood. Now, in case some of you may not have left 5 minutes ago but are going to leave 5 minutes from now, let me tell you before the punchline, that this doesn't mean that you can't do anything about this. And it doesn't mean that these people are all going to have heart disease, but it means that there's a higher risk for this. And it doesn't mean that you can't try to adapt some of this, but it means that something happened that created a biological change that didn't go away, even though then the rest of your life may be fine and you may not have problems with maltreatment. And also, this doesn't mean like a bad day. It doesn't mean like there was a week where the family was kind of stressed out and the kid was ignored, or this is kind of long-term chronic. In this case, it was harsh kinds of physical experiences, physical and emotional experiences in childhood. So I want to talk a little bit about neglect, and I'm almost finished with the science part, and I'm soon going to move into kind of, so how do we use this? So again, this is something that most of you in this audience know well, but I'm just going to tee it up there so we're all in the same place. If you look at any child protective service system in the country and look at the distribution of reasons why children are brought into the child welfare system as active cases, it's a relatively smaller percentage of children who are brought in because of physical or sexual abuse, even though these get the most attention in the press. But somewhere between 75 and 80% across the country of children in the child welfare system are in because of a concern about neglect, which is a very difficult thing to define. And I would invite some of you, if you want to know more about this, because we don't have time for me to talk about this morning, we have a working paper from our council on the science of neglect and what it does to the brain. That's on our website. I'll give you the URL at the end, and I invite you to go and look at that report. It gets into all of the details of what we know about why neglect is actually, from a neurobiological point of view, more dangerous and more harmful to the brain than physical abuse. And I'm not making this up. So that's the other thing I want you to understand. I'm not kind of exaggerating any of these things to kind of get people riled up. There are other people who do that better than I do. Our niche in the field is to be very conservative about the science, so that our credibility about not overstating it is never questioned, and to really have people understand what the consequences are of some of these things. So some of you, and probably a lot of you, are familiar with this video, but it's too powerful to not show it for those of you who don't know it. This is a video from a study that was done decades ago by Ed Tronick up in Boston. It's the still-faced phenomenon. It was one of the first behavioral studies that showed us the consequences to a young child of a lack of responsiveness, a lack of serve and return. And this information, this knowledge has been around for decades. And the first video I showed, which showed, oh, these terrible things that happen when a parent isn't responsive, you put a brain scan up and everybody goes, oh my goodness, this is like a big problem. And the poor behavioral and developmental scientists who told us this 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, it took a brain scan to get people to pay attention, but it doesn't really matter. It's the same message. So just for curiosity, how many of you know about the still face? Okay, how many don't? Sorry to. Okay, good. Enough of you so it's not wasting your time. So here we go.
Babies this young are extremely responsive to the emotions and the reactivity and the social interaction that they get from the world around them. This is something that we started studying 30, 40 years ago, when people didn't think that infants could engage in social interaction. In the still face experiment, what the mother did was she sits down and she's playing with her baby, who's about a year of age.
I'm like a girl. Oh.
And she gives a greeting to the baby gives a greeting back to her.
Yeah.
This baby starts pointing at different places in the world, and the mother's trying to engage her and play with her. They're working to coordinate their emotions and their intentions, what they want to do in the world. And that's really what the baby is used to. And then we ask the mother to not respond to the baby. The baby very quickly picks up on this, and then she uses all of her abilities to try and get the mother back. She smiles at the mother. She points because she's used to the mother looking where she points. The baby puts both hands up in front of her and says, "What's happening here?" She makes that screechy sound at the mother, like, come on, why aren't we doing this? Even in this 2 minutes when they don't get the normal reaction, They react with negative emotions. They turn away. They feel the stress of it. They actually may lose control of their posture because of the stress that they're experiencing.
Okay. I'm here. And what are you doing? Oh, yes. Oh, what a big girl.
I've never gotten used to this video where it doesn't like really grab you. So, but the point of this is that this has nothing to do with how much a parent loves a child. A seriously depressed person can't respond in a consistent way. Someone who is incapacitated by a substance abuse problem can't consistently respond. This is not an issue of whether you care about your child. This is an issue of whether you have problems that need help in order to keep that availability of responsiveness intact. This is not a blaming situation. This is an understanding situation and an ability to correct and to heal a situation. So the science lesson is over. Now I'm going to just spend the last few minutes telling you about how we're thinking about using this not only for people to take this and go and march to the legislature or the city council or to other places and say, you know, we need more money for these programs, which we obviously do, and the best of them are critically important in terms of the difference they make in children's lives. But I want to give you a little bit of a window into how science is opening up the possibility for us to kind of be that much better, because we all know, everybody here knows, those of you who are in the best programs, that we make a big difference for a lot of children and families, and we make very little difference for some children and families because we are unable to deal with the magnitude of problems that families are facing in these programs that are limited in what they can do. So the question is, not saying, well, it's too complicated, but how do we do better? So very briefly, if you look at now what is approaching a half a century of early childhood policy and practice, Head Start is 2 years away from its 50th birthday, and neighborhood health centers and home visiting programs, all of these things were part of the War on Poverty and the Great Society programs in the 60s. The basic conceptual framework that undergirds most of the programs we have right now are based on the notion that some combination of parenting education, sound nutrition, stimulating experiences for children, not only in their homes with support, but in center-based programs, primary medical care, and a health-promoting environment will produce readiness to succeed in school, a healthy trajectory, and it's school readiness that is the thing that most policymakers are focused on. And in most cases, in the majority of families, rich and poor, of all races and ethnicities living in urban and rural areas, between the families and their communities and their neighbors and programs, more than half of the kids, a good number of kids, are ready to coming to school and ready to succeed. But there's a part of the population that, even with what we have right now, is still impaired in a variety of ways in terms of what school is asking you to do. And our hypothesis is that the reason for that is not just about quality improvement in the programs and more, better ratios of adults to children, but that for some children and families, the level of adversity is so great that they overwhelm what we're able to do in these programs. And if that's the case, then we need to do something other than just say, let's get a better curriculum and let's work harder, that we need to do something about the adversity. So here's how we're thinking in our Frontiers of Innovation, which is involving people from around the country to use science to come up to design and test some new interventions and new policies. So we start in looking at the science. There's a very powerful message that came through to us about two major propositions that I hate, it's a hackneyed term to talk about a paradigm shift, but they really represent a paradigm shift for early childhood, which is basically a school readiness policy issue. The first is that early experiences affect lifelong health as much as they affect learning. This should not just be a problem for the Department of Education. The health agencies need to be concerned about this as well. It's not just about early literacy. It's preventing heart disease and stroke and diabetes and hypertension years later, which are disproportionately distributed across the population, much higher rates in poor populations and communities of color dealing with a lot of stress. Also, if you look at the science, and many of you who are on the front lines know exactly what I'm talking about, healthy development requires more than just providing enrichment. It requires a combination of protection and enrichment. It's not just enriched learning opportunities, more language exposure, which is obviously important, But there are many children who can't benefit from that because the consequences of toxic stress and adversity on their development is making them less able to benefit from enrichment, and we need to provide protection against these sources of significant stress. And so taking these propositions, and now, mind you, a reminder, all of this is hypothesis now, if you ask me. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. So where are the data for this? There are no program data because we haven't done this yet. This is kind of what we're thinking about. What we've done is enrichment. What we've done is school readiness. When it comes to health, we say, are your immunizations up to date? Do you have a doctor? Check, check. Do you have dental care? Check. Move on. And we don't ask about what this means for lifelong health. So here are hypotheses that we're actually now on the ground turning into some things that we're designing and testing. The first is to say, if we have to do more than enrichment and provide protection as well as enrichment, that means that we have to not just give information to parents and people who work in programs, we have to build their capacities to provide this kind of buffering protection against sources of adversity. It's not enough to say, well, these things are bad, and read to your child, and here are some books, and talk to your child, and we'll see you next week. Okay, because we have adults, not only parents, but also people who work in many child care programs where there are some extraordinarily well-trained, competent people, and also a lot of low-income women with limited education who have the same problems of the mothers in many programs who are trying to help. And they want to do better, but they haven't, because of their own life circumstances, built these capacities. So as we started to talk about skill building, not just information, and capability building in parents, then we started to go, and maybe in the Q&A I'll tell you the backstory, which is an interesting one, is that these skills that you need to be a good parent are also a lot of the skills that you need to be employable and to get a job and to move up. Organize yourselves, kind of solve problems, figure things out, control your impulses. And so if we're building these skills instead of just giving parenting information, we're improving parents' abilities to be able to get a job and hold a job and move up, and that will improve the environment for child development. So we have this totally other world of workforce development and adult-focused anti-poverty programs that have to be part of early childhood programs, because the bottom line for this is if we're going to change children's lives, we have to transform the lives of the adults who are taking care of them. We can't bypass that. And then the third issue is the community role here. So all of us understand the importance of a community-based approach. But the question is, what's the theory of change? How does that affect children's health? And then it gets a little bit more specific. It's not just about empowerment and social capital. It's about what are we doing to reduce the burden of adversity on families based on the specific sources of stress in this community and that community, as opposed to just talking generically about community empowerment. We need to get more specific and focus on what is making life hard for families. So this gets to these issues of what are these skills I'm talking about, and I'm almost done. So these skills are, a lot of them come under the umbrella of mental health, and we'll probably talk a lot about that in the Q&A. But there's another dimension which neuroscience is helping us now think about, which is that all those other things that happen in this front part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex, and we know even where a lot of these skills are located, where the circuits are. These are so-called executive function and self-regulation skills, things like the ability to focus and sustain your attention, set goals, make plans, follow rules, solve problems, monitor what you're doing, delay gratification, control your impulses. Sound familiar? Does this have anything to do with being able to succeed in school, to be able to be employable, to be able to kind of have control over your life? Is this a problem when you're dealing on the edge every day with just getting by and can't plan for next week, no less, next year? These skills are buildable. So here's back to the biology. Mother Nature is saying, I'm going to give you another chance. You haven't noticed this for 50 years, but I'm going to give you another chance. Wake up. So the circuits for these skills in the prefrontal cortex have the longest period of development and flexibility, plasticity of any part of the brain. And where these skills are built, the period of greatest acceleration of development of these skills is in the age range from 3 to 5. You can see the difference between 3 and a 5-year-old. And this is where your grandmother could have told you that the difference between a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old is a 5-year-old can pay attention better and can control impulses better and can follow rules and understands how to play Simon Says, and a 3-year-old can't, even though, because you have to understand the rule changes. And then all of a sudden it continues to develop, but not as rapidly. But then there's another blip in late adolescence and early adult life, where there's an accelerated development of these higher level executive function and self-regulation skills. And what we know is the way they get developed is by coaching and practice, and we give information to people and advice at a time when coaching and practice on these skills can accelerate their development. There's an area that's very exciting to think about. So last slide, before I have my quick summary, we tested this hypothesis in a big database that we just developed, which has 47 years of program data on everything that's been done from birth to age 5. 10,000 studies, narrowed down to 88 of the best studies of center-based early childhood education programs, looking at their impact across 88 programs on cognitive skills and pre-academic skills in programs baseline where there was no active parent engagement. And this is the magnitude these programs make a difference. This is the magnitude of their impact. If you then say of the programs that had a parenting education component that gave information to parents, how did it affect the children's outcomes? No different. But what about those programs that worked on modeling and active skill building with parents? Did that have any additional effect on the children's reading and math skills and cognitive scores when they finished? And that's what happened. The data speak for themselves. You doubled the impact on pre-academic skills by building the skills and modeling skills for parents as opposed to just letting them drop their kids off and pick them up or giving them a cheat sheet on child development. So here's the new frontier, and then I am finished. The new frontier is if we think about how science and policy and practice come together, the first thing that science is letting us do now, it is elucidating, helping us understand the causal links between significant adversity in childhood and lifelong impairments in learning, behavior, and health. Not just, well, we know that poverty is associated with poor outcomes, or adversity related to being victimized by systematic exclusion, social exclusion, or structural bases for inequity that produce differences later. We've known that for a long time. Now we know how it happens inside the body, and it gives us some new ideas about what to do other than just providing support. It also gives us new ideas about how to design and test new interventions based on these greater understandings of how these adversities get into the body. Specifically, how do we protect the developing brain and the cardiovascular system and the immune system from the consequences of toxic stress? And at a population level, it means that we have to think about how to reduce the economic and social threats that are imposing these burdens on children, because we know that they're doing harm, not just because we say, oh, this is a bad thing. And it means that we can't just say, well, the answer is to eliminate poverty and eliminate racism. For me, the issue is, what do we do in the meantime, a little bit more specifically, to help children do better? So here's our website. We have a lot of the materials up there if you'd like. They're all free to be downloaded, including the videos. And I'm finished now, and let's go to the panel. So thank you very much.
Is that not awesome? It's amazing. Thank you. So panel, why don't you come on up and join Dr. Shonkoff?
Jack is
Jack. Okay. So I want to introduce our panel, and we'll sort of build on what we were just learning about. We have about an hour left, which is perfect. Sitting next to Jack is Linda Lausell Bryant. She's the executive director of Inwood House. She's a member of the Child Welfare Watch Advisory Board, and she formerly worked at ACS in charge of youth development programs. Next to her is Pia Footman, who is a writer for Rise magazine and now for Child Welfare Watch as well. She's the author of a first-person article in the issue that we handed out on your way in the door. We'll hear from her in a minute about her experience in the Chances for Children program. Next to her is Benita Miller, Deputy Commissioner of the Division of Family Permanency Services at the Administration for Children's Services, which means she is overseeing the foster care side of the system primarily. And she is the founder and former director of the Brooklyn Young Mothers Collective and a former Legal Aid Society attorney in family court. And I think I first met her when she was an organizer with Urban Homesteading Assistance Board about 20 years ago. And next to her is Susan Chinitz, professor of clinical pediatrics and distinguished scholar in pediatrics at Albert Einstein College of Medicine and director of the Early Childhood Center and the Center for Babies, Toddlers, and Families at Einstein. So I actually want to start with Pia, and you can look over here if you want. Your son now is 8 years old, right? Xavier?
Yes.
So this was about 4 years ago. He landed in kinship foster care at your grandma's,
Yes.
right? And the court sent you to sort of traditional parenting programs. So if you could talk a little bit about what that was like, what your first experience of the things they sent you to do, what was that like?
Well, the first 7 parenting classes that I was sent to were awful. They put me in a group with other parents, and there was a teacher that spoke to us from this big parenting book and told us basically, and showed us videos as well of parents telling their children, you're in a timeout now, and then everything magically worked. And then they would turn off the video, and then they would say, remember what you did in the video, what you saw in the video, go home, and that's how you parent. Or they would hand out like sheets and say, follow these things, put your kid in timeout, take away their toys. But when I got home, none of those things worked. And my son Xavier would play in the timeout. If I would take the toy away, he would look for it and get it again and play with it. So, it was like, they weren't helpful. They weren't helpful.
And what was it? Sort of your own, you talked to me a little bit about your own parenting skills and sort of at that time, sort of where they came from. Like, what was it, what did you think about parenting? What did you know about parenting when you were younger?
Well, what I knew is from my grandmother, she raised me, it was children ought to be seen and not heard. And when I tell you to do something, you're just supposed to do it no matter what. It does not work like that.
Mm-hmm. Surprise.
It does not, no. Children have their own mind.
Right.
And feelings, too.
Right. So eventually, after these sort of more traditional parenting programs that we've all been hearing about for so many years, how did you find Chances for Children?
I had been using some drugs, and then I went and left my son in the house alone to purchase more drugs. Then I had got arrested and my son had got taken away, and then I went to a psychiatric facility for 18 months, and then I decided when I came out that I had to get my son back. So during that process, the judge said, we're going to send you to a different type of parenting class. And then I went to Chances for Children.
And tell us a little bit about that program.
Chances for Children is a good place to go for parents. Because we got to interact together with the therapist there on video, and then she played it back for us on the so the first visit you get recorded, then the next time you come back they review the tape, and that's how it goes. So you get recorded.
And you're with your son.
And then I'm with my son. So we would play, and then I got to see the video afterward, and it would show me that what I was doing wrong, and how we were interacting with each other. And so most of the time I was like, when I got bored with a toy, I would just be like, all right, Xavier, we're gonna move on now. And that frustrated him because he wasn't ready. But because I'm thinking I'm his mom, he has to listen. Even if he's not ready, it's time to move on. And that's not, I felt like a bully because that's not what I'm supposed to do. I'm supposed to allow him to play.
And I love, there's a point in your essay where you talk about how you went the other direction so far that you couldn't stop him after a while.
Oh yeah, yeah. So he just couldn't stop playing. He didn't want to stop playing. So we had that problem too, where I couldn't get him to stop playing when it was time to clean up. So they told me, the therapist, she said what I needed to do was give him like a 5-minute warning before, to see if that worked better. Yeah.
And it worked, right?
And it works.
But mainly it's sort of this question. So Linda, you've got the same kind of, a similar sort of program at Inwood House, right? And I mean, the basic point being, instead of sitting in a classroom learning things from a lecture, this is all about coaching and working and getting video feedback. And how do you, tell us a little bit about the SPIN program, first of all.
Okay. So the SPIN model was developed in the Netherlands and then brought to the United States, and it's basically based on a lot of the science that Dr. Shonkoff just talked about, which is the importance of the relationship between a caring adult or a caretaker and the child. And you know, Donald Winnicott said there is no such thing as an infant, and what he meant by that was you cannot talk about an infant without putting that infant in the context of his or her caretaker. So any work with an infant obviously has to involve the caretaker. So you take information on parenting, as you shared, Pia. It's helpful to have this information, but the real question is, how do we change practice? So can you take information that's delivered, you know, to you in a cognitive fashion and somehow convert that into practice? And I think anyone who runs any kind of a business where you have staff, I think this is a challenge we all have, right? How do we really help our staff members to practice in a different or better way? Is it sufficient to have classroom-based training? So what video interaction guidance has been shown to do, and that is the technology, if you will, of the SPIN program. The technology or the magic is not the videotape. It's actually on the focus of the interaction between the parent and the child. So what video interaction guidance does is it identifies where the strengths lie. So it's truly strengths-based practice, and it helps in that way to create healthy attachments and support both social, emotional, and cognitive development of the baby. How do we do that? By focusing on both verbal and nonverbal cues between the parent and the child, focusing on the quality and the nature of the interaction. So if you think about, let's think of video interaction guidance as focusing on three main components. It's a microscope. You're really looking at the interactions in very close attention. So you're really focusing on even the tiniest little interaction. The baby points and the mother looks. That little interaction. So it's as you're focusing on. What happened there? Why did the baby point? What's the baby trying to do? And why did the mom look in that direction? And what happened? What's that dance between the parent and the child? Video interaction guidance also provides a mirror. The young person is able to, or the parent is able to look at him or herself and say, I see a responsive parent there. I see a nurturing parent. And for young people who are parenting, who are, let's say, in foster care, now they are parents, one of the biggest challenges in parenting education is how do you take any individual who's had no personal experience of a nurturing parenting, and how do you take that and now ask that person to become a nurturing parent? Where is the internal working model of what that is? So what the SPIN program does is it mirrors for that parent what they look like as a good parent. Right. So they become their own internal working model. And finally, it's a magnifier. This model magnifies what they do well. And as we know, just in terms of human motivation, we're all motivated to do more of what we do well. Right. We all respond to that.
And the key here is that you're doing this with teenage moms who have been in foster care, have their own child now. Right. And like you said, many of them have experienced neglect and abuse. Some of them are victims of sex abuse. And they are not, and so in doing this videotape thing, like you said, they are seeing themselves, you're editing it so that their best parenting comes back at them as the model. Right?
Exactly. Yeah. And many young parents who, teenage parents, period, whether they are in the foster care system or not, the general feedback they get from society as a whole is, you're not going to do this really well. You're not going to be a good parent. So they're used to hearing that feedback, right? They're used to, whether that judgment comes across verbally or non-verbally, they know that that's what is expected of them. So it's incredibly powerful to have a situation where there's proof, not because I said it, but because they can see it with their own eyes. Right. And so it allows them to internalize that.
Right. So Pia, does that resonate with you, what you're hearing?
Yes, it does. Even like on the New York City subway trains, there's signs that say that your child, if you're a teen parent, that your child will not make it to high school.
Right.
So I'm on the train and I'm riding and I'm like, I'm a failure as a mom already. And
Right.
you didn't even give me a chance yet.
Right.
Like my oldest child is 12.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Benita,
Yes.
so tell us a little bit about what you're doing, what you all are trying to do in the foster care system, and to change some of the work going on there.
So I watched the video and I'm listening to you all and I'm thinking about the work that we're doing to build parental capacity, and our demonstration project, Child Success NYC, resonates in that we're bringing to bear evidence-based models that will help strengthen our family foster care continuum in short lengths of stay. And also for our teen parents who are in care, we are working with the Ackerman Institute to develop curriculum focused on the parental capacity of young mothers and fathers who are in care, but also focus on how they parent. So it's twofold, particularly with the young parents, in that we do want to strengthen their ability to see themselves as graduating from high school and on-ramp into college, because we still have an underlying obligation to make sure that they have secure futures, so that they are not coming back into our system as adults. What resonated with me when Dr. Shonkoff spoke was the notion of parental capacity, and how do we leverage these models to create systemic change and cultural shifts within our agency. And I think that Child Success NYC, which includes Parenting Through Change, which is focused on parental behavior and is done in small cohorts, so that the case planner is trained to help families work together in these small groups around their parenting behavior. And I've had an opportunity to observe those groups, and what's powerful to me is not just the intervention, but the unintended consequences of the intervention, and that we're helping families feel what we know is natural. Like, we all know that if you're a parent, or if you're in a family, because every human is in a family, that you interact in a way where you rely on each other for social capital and that feedback loop. So what was powerful about the group is that it allowed parents who are in our system, in terms of being in family court, have a natural place to talk about the difficulties of having to go to court, having to talk about how hard a visit was, because visiting your child and dealing with court and going to all of the referrals can be a source of stress. And not feeling like the case planner is gonna write it down somewhere and judge you later, or that it will be a bad thing because you're having a hard day. And then also, for foster parents, to make sure that we have placement stability, we are using KEEP. The model is designed so that foster parents also can work with parents to understand what's happening with the child, but also in the foster home, how do you manage behavior and expectations? How do you manage when a child has a bad visit? How do you react? Because our foster parents pour themselves into the work as well, and they also see them, view themselves as experts in this work. So how do you help them leverage their lived experience in the household with children to effectuate good outcomes for a family?
Right. So 3/4 of the kids, more than 3/4 of the kids who come into foster care in New York City return home. So visiting is clearly like fundamental. How does the lessons we heard from Jack about all the science, how does that translate into the visiting experience?
In Parenting Through Change, we do have visiting coaching happening, and we also have visiting logs that are entered. So if someone has a bad visit, I don't want to start with someone has a bad visit, right? Let's start with they have very good visits. We document that and we share that with parents so that they understand how they're making progress. There's also an opportunity to get information about how the child is doing and to interact with the foster family in a very structured and nurturing way, which really matters.
Yeah, and that's you got to get the foster parents ready and willing and
That's key.
happy to do this, right?
Yes.
So Susan, can you talk a little bit? You've been working around these systems for a while and trying to implement a lot of the kinds of programs we've been discussing. And you've got your own program at the Early Childhood Center. One of the things you were telling me the other day is about that sort of experience with what is a good foster parent and sort of different notions of that. Can you talk a little bit about that, and then we'll hear more detail about your program.
Well, I guess I'll say less about what's a good foster parent, but what do our foster parents need from us?
Yeah.
Is maybe a better place
That's a better
to
way of
start.
putting it, right.
Well, first of all, we don't tell foster parents everything that they need to know to raise their children well. The children that go into foster care have extremely complicated histories. Little as they are, they've often lived through, quite a lot already. And those events, as Dr. Shonkoff said, and as we all know, affect them on a day-to-day basis. But we don't share that information about their backgrounds and about their needs with foster parents. So when these very, very complex children get into their foster homes, their foster parents really are flying by the seat of their pants very often in figuring out how to work with the kids. These children have histories of abuse and trauma and sometimes sexual abuse. They're often highly symptomatic children. And if you don't know that background or don't know how to respond to children that way, we often get punitive responses or responses that just reaffirm the children's beliefs that they can't really depend on the adults in their world. So we really do need to share more information with our foster parents and help them learn how to manage children in a much more therapeutic way. I think we also don't have great criteria by which we select foster parents or by which we evaluate how foster parents are doing with their children. We have standards about size and quality of homes and things like that, but we're not really looking into the attachment and relationship histories of our foster parents, and we know that caregivers' state of mind about attachment is the single most predictive factor for how children will do or how they'll recover from adversity. I don't think we pay enough attention to the attachment histories of foster parents. Sometimes they, like bio parents who have had histories of adversity, project wrong intentions onto their foster children and keep up some of the same interactive problems that the kids have had in other situations. So our foster parents need as much help as our bio parents do sometimes in how to respond therapeutically to children. Our children's caregivers are the best promise that they have. We also have some policies that I think are concerning in terms of foster parents. We have a lot of foster parents who are working full-time and leave children in child care centers. Many of our kids really need very full-time therapeutic caregivers. When they come in with all the attachment disorders and attachment disruptions that the kids have experienced and traumatic experiences, and then we send them to child care programs and they're cared for by a roster of different people, it doesn't really help them recover. So I know we're hard-pressed for foster parents, and we can't always ensure that those resource parents will be with children, but young children really need reliable caregivers who are with them, for long periods of time.
And we'll come back a little bit to talking about, there's some feedback, talk a little bit about the sort of systems of childcare, for example, and early childhood programs, and what kind of capacity needs to be there as well. Because it's very hard to find a foster parent who's able to stay home all day with foster kids, right?
And we have other issues like foster parent vacations, which often result in a child being placed in a substitute foster home for 6 or 8 weeks. Many of our foster parents have homes in other countries, the Dominican Republic, places like that, and go for long periods of time. And then we take our vulnerable kids who are developing new attachments and have a vacation happen. So we have to work on those policies because these kids need a lot of support to get on a better trajectory. So we work with foster parents at the Early Childhood Center as intensively as we do with biological parents and help them translate what they see into a better understanding of how this connects to the children's history and try to mobilize more appropriate responses to the children's behaviors and symptoms.
And how many families are you working with there at any given time?
We have a pretty large center. We're working with, I don't know, 250, 300 families at any one time.
Right. And so they're not all coming from family court, are they? Or?
No, not all. We have a large percentage, maybe 30 to 40% of our children are known to the child welfare system.
Yep. And it's very much a similar kind of program as what we've heard about already?
It's all of our services are relationship-based and dyadically based. You need to see an interaction in order to know what has contributed to child welfare system involvement. You need to really, children have bring different parenting demands. Not all kids are alike, and we need to know what the adult's state of mind about attachment is, what their executive functions are like, what a child triggers in a parent. All of these are obscured when an intervention is not a dyadic or relationship-based one.
Right. So I want to ask all of you, we can start with Jack, are we improving? Are we getting better at the way we design these systems? I mean, we're hearing about these programs in New York City, some of which are brand new, some of which have been around a decade or more, but they're not necessarily reflective of the entire system of child care and child welfare and preventive family support. Are we getting better in the United States in how we deal with this?
So I think like everybody here, see, I'm constitutionally optimistic, so I can't go to the negative side. But it's a hard push to kind of, if you look at big data on a population basis, to see a positive trend. But I think what we need to do is, well, this is, for me, a very important point. We're really good, and we've been for a long time into this mindset that what we have to do when things are not getting better is to keep getting more data to show how bad things are and how things aren't getting better. And now we're even more sophisticated doing that than we used to be because we have all these fancy kind of capacities to deal with big data. And I think that's the wrong approach. I mean, I think what we have to do is do two different things to deal with the fact that things aren't getting better enough. I mean, because they're getting better in some places and they're not changing in others. So on the whole, it doesn't really mean anything to ask if we're getting better. I think we have to get a lot better at how we explain and how we translate this science to non-scientists, particularly people in policy-making positions and people who control resource allocation, to not start by telling them how bad they are and how insensitive they are and how they don't care, but to tell them that we have a deeper understanding of a lot of these things now, and we have some new ideas about what to do. Because there's a dominant mindset that these problems are very complicated and they're hard to do anything about. And a lot of our advocacy reinforces that by telling people how complicated it is and how it's not getting better. So that's kind of one thing, which is, I think, to change our strategy and focus more on what we could be doing differently, as opposed to just give us more money to do what we're doing. And the second thing related to that is you can't really figure out what to do differently unless there's some space to try some new things based on science. So this is where I wish I had learned earlier in my career about the value of learning what works well in the business world and thinking how to bring it into our world. Because in the business world, if you're doing really well, you don't just sit back and say, we're doing really well. You're constantly thinking about how to get to the next place first and be better and better. And so there's this notion of having an R&D component to whatever it is you're doing, like thinking about what's going to be next. And we have no R&D component in human services and education. In the healthcare system, we have research on diseases. You know, everybody understands that. And that has produced a lot of progress in treating diseases. We have no R&D component on what to do about racial and social class disparities in health outcomes. Right. We focus on unequal access to care, which is important. We focus on unequal treatment in the healthcare system, which is important. But we don't focus on what is it about being disadvantaged. It makes you sick more. And so I really think that there's a tremendous need for some new strategies here, that I think the stuff that's really making a difference needs to be protected. The stuff that could be making a better difference, that could improve the quality of it, how it can do it, needs to be helped to improve its quality. But we need some new strategies about what we have to say to the people who control resources and how we make it more enticing to give us more money because we're developing new ideas. And the fact, I think the worst message and the worst strategy for not getting better is to say, we know exactly what to do, all we need is the money. I think that's the wrong idea, because we don't know exactly what to do in a lot of these situations. And the worst part of it is, and I'll stop being on a pulpit here, is that the programs with the families and the children who have the most complex problems require some of the most complex skills of any job you could have in this country, in the world. And we don't pay people enough to do this. We don't make it an attractive career with the kind of status it ought to have. So what's wrong with this picture? You need the most skilled people who you give the less amount of money to and then demonize them when something bad happens. And so I think that's what we should be doing, rather than coming out with the latest data about how the poverty rate just went up, or more kids or less kids are in this circumstance, which only reinforces for people that it's too hard to get anything done.
Right.
That's not science, that's my own personal opinion. So.
Benita, you used to be outside the system.
Yes.
Now you're inside the system. Are there surprises in terms of this question of, are things better than you thought? Are things still huge things to accomplish?
Well, first I have to answer the foster care question, the foster parent because
okay.
we are developing foster parent competencies to address some of the concerns that Dr. Chinitz raised around what are the qualities that our foster provider agencies, what tools can we share with them so that they know what our system expectations are in terms of who are good foster parents, and good meaning, are they appropriate for our children in terms of what we want for their outcomes beyond our system. So I would say that having worked outside of the system and now being part of the system, being very happy to be part of the system at a critical point where the foster care census has trended downward, and we have real opportunities to do innovative things, and for Children's Services to be a very external-facing organization and look at the landscape of where do we need to develop relationships so that we make a difference in the lives of families who come to our attention, both through early ECE, I could never, early learning child education, I could never get it always right on that one, or whether they're coming through our preventive door, whether they're coming through our juvenile justice door, or whether they're coming through our child welfare system door. We have an obligation to the future of the children, youth, and families who come to our attention for help to think about how do we deepen our connections in community life so that we are helping to deal with issues of poverty. Child success will work if we make sure that some of the things that bring families to our attention, such as poverty, when we know that they can have access to employment.
Yeah.
We can dose to forever, but unless we really are committed to changing the cultural experiences of our agencies and of our systems, we can't get farther than what we can get there. But if we don't try to see ourselves as something larger, then we won't be able to. And so, yes, is it different? Is it a real opportunity to make change and leverage what I know from being on the ground in community and working directly with young people? I'm excited about what we're doing at ACS. I'm excited that families are responding to the programs that we're putting in place and that they feel like we are a helpful organization or a helpful agency in their lives, and that we're willing to stretch ourselves to develop partnerships that are meaningful to the outcomes of poor families across New York City.
And if I may just add, I certainly didn't mean to be critical. I think everyone who knows my work knows that in addition to our therapeutic work, another major characteristic of what we do is what I would call relentless collaboration with the child welfare system. And so I have to say I've been incredibly impressed with the strides and inroads that ACS has made over the last couple of years. There are countless ways in which I think things are getting better. The use of promising practices and evidence-based interventions across all of the different preventive and foster care services, many policies that are very important to young children, like pre-removal conferences. There are lists of things I've made for myself about how ACS is responding to what we are learning. It's just a vast system, and it's hard to infiltrate at every single level, from the leadership all the way down to the women who provide direct care to children. But I think things are definitely taking a step in the right direction for very vulnerable young children within ACS.
Right. I think, you know, having been writing and researching the system for 20 years, it is kind of stunning to see the change, actually. And I mean, we always talked about culture change, and there are still big issues of culture change, which we should get to. And yet the culture change back in 1997 when we started Child Welfare Watch, or before that when we were doing other projects around this, the culture change was about setting up systems where people respected preventive family support services rather than removal as an initial option. So that's a big change. Jack.
I just add one more point to really reinforce what a lot of my colleagues on the panel have said, and to clarify one of the points that I was making, which in the beginning, which I don't want to misunderstand. I think we have enough to say, and we ought to say it with a lot of pride, that there's a fair amount of things that we know how to do right now that we can do really well and that make a big difference. I mean, you know, Pia's experiences with Chances for Children is a wonderful example of the fact that we know how to do things right in a lot of cases, and we have to match that with another message that also says that we also have a loving, nurturing, constructive dissatisfaction with what we're accomplishing as a whole in these systems. And that when people, I think the best way to answer people who say, well, you know, none of this stuff is making a difference, rather than say, oh, yes, it is to say, we've got a lot of things that are making a difference. So let us show you some of them. But we're not happy with the overall results either. And so instead of bashing all this stuff, let's start thinking about what we could do differently. Because I think when we fight back and say, oh, no, you're wrong, all you have to do is fund the good stuff, then I think we're not in as powerful a position.
So you had, on your final slide, you talked about building in the capacity for protection and enrichment in these other systems, in the education system, in early childhood education, in child care, mental health, all of those areas that, I mean, none of these truly exist separately. Linda, you want to talk about that?
Yeah, just to, Jack, you stepped off the soapbox, and I'll jump on it now for you. It is about building, absolutely, it is about building capacity across all of these systems. We're talking about building the capacity of parents and caregivers. That would include staff in human services agencies, includes building the capacity of foster parents. So I think Jack is right that we have these pockets of brilliant practice across the city, and I would dare to say that New York City probably has more than most in that regard. What I think is missing is a really coherent policy framework that anchors this. And absent that, what happens is these programs are vulnerable to whatever the politics are of the given day, which influence the funding streams. There's an opportunity here to really educate funders about what works. And I want to issue this caution about this move towards, because we're a very trendy field, right? So the new trend is evidence-based practice. It is really great that we have moved to elevating the issue of evidence. However, one of the cautions is to make sure that we don't choke out promising practices. If we only fund everything that we've already figured out works, we're going to really miss out on the R&D that you talked about. And that component is really never funded or supported in our sector.
Right.
That's the part we've got to figure out for ourselves, as well as training and professional development for staff. It's the first thing to go in hard times. And as you know, we've been in hard times for quite some time. So I think if you think about New York City, one of the things we don't have is a citywide policy around youth. We don't have a youth policy, a comprehensive youth policy that would cut across all of the different areas, education, childcare, health. So we need all of these practices and policies not to be scattershot as they are now, but really anchored in a coherent framework that gets reviewed and revisited and formed by the latest evidence.
Right. So Susan, we tell in one of the, Susan, in one of our articles, we talk about the work you have done to try and elevate this among legislators and funders and so on. I mean, I think one of the contextual issues here is we're dealing with a city where we've been cutting back funding on childcare. We've been fighting in city council to preserve after-school programs. I mean, these are like these big picture questions. Very little money out there for housing subsidies for kids coming out of foster care, for example. Where does this work rank in importance against all of that? Or to put it differently, how do you integrate this work, that message of the importance of this work, into that larger question of we need to support all of this stuff?
I think it's been hard for people to appreciate the importance of infancy and early childhood. Our babies don't make a lot of trouble for people, and
Right.
they are raised behind closed doors very often. Yet we who are trying to work with young children and families are inundated with need all the time that we, work hard to meet but can never meet to the extent that we need to. So I have worked as hard as I could to, have people in systems responsible be aware of this need, and we have had good success along the way, mostly through the New York City Council, which has funded a number of our infant mental health programs around the city. But as we've discussed, this funding is 1 year at a time. We spend half of the year trying to recoup the funding again for the second year, taking us very far away from the work that we're really trying to do. And like Linda said, we need a system. We need a system where you don't have to live near one good program or another, but any young child or parent can access service no matter where they live. And we don't have any sustainability beyond, this just relentless pursuit of city council money. So we continue to work. We're making some progress. We need to make a lot more progress. We need policies, but also systems where anybody can pick up a telephone and say, I've got a 2-year-old who's in a lot of distress, and be directed to the right kind of services. We don't have that now.
Right. Jack?
Yeah, I'd love to respond to the systems issue because, there is no National Association for the Preservation of Fragmented, disjuncted systems, So we all, Susan is so right that we need more of a systemic approach, but we haven't figured out how to do that. And I think one of the things we've learned is that, including some tough places, we've done a lot of work around the country in places that are even, with all the problems that you're talking about in New York, it's a bastion of advancement compared to other parts of the country that don't even think about this stuff. But we found that when you start with the politics, you start with system building, it's almost like the argument's gone and over before you even get to the second paragraph, because everybody's got their strong views on this. And part of the problem of system building is that people speak different languages, they go to different meetings, they have different training programs, and they're not really speaking the same language. And the best that we can do is ask them to kind of communicate better with each other. And what's another exciting opportunity for this science is there's only one science for all these systems, right? This is the science of how healthy development happens, and it's the science of how it gets derailed. And so when we started out, even something as split as, like the early childhood system, has nothing to do with the adult anti-poverty system, workforce development, right? Nothing at all. And when we started, people said, well, there are two systems you can never get to work together because they're so in different worlds. And we actually have a number of places where people are working together on those because they've suddenly found it's not just like sharing notes. It's the same. We spent all this time talking about building adult capabilities. I was at a conference of people who were dealing with welfare reform and workforce development, and they were interested in this stuff. And there were people who were practically in tears who said, we have been fighting a losing battle going downhill fast. All the emphasis is on early childhood right now, and we're even more marginalized, and nobody cares about poor adults. Well, guess what? Poor adults are the parents we're talking about whose skills we're trying to build. And all of a sudden, it's like we're doing the same thing. So now you've got a lot of money that's being spent in it's not as much as we need, but it's not an insignificant amount of money that could be used much more efficiently and effectively in a coordinated effort. So part of my fantasy about this would be, 15 years from now, 20 years, people would say, could you believe in 2013 that the adult workforce development programs were totally disconnected from the adult parenting and skill building programs? What were they thinking in 2013? Right. And right now, some people's answer to that is we need to co-locate them. We need to have them in the same. It's much more than co-location. They're both talking about building skills. And we've had backlash in the early childhood community in the beginning where people said, What's all this stuff about focusing on building adult skills? It's the kids we're talking about. Why are you focusing on the adults? It's the kids we're trying to help. And then you get back to David Winnicott. You can't help kids without changing the lives of the adults who are taking care of them. So I think I think system building has to move beyond, because Susan really hit it. It's such a huge problem. But we're stuck on interagency agreements and sharing data systems without talking about the substance of what we're doing.
Right.
And this is one science.
Yeah, and without thinking about outcomes that are shared across the board. Instead, each agency has its own objectives. Pia.
I just wanted to say something quickly. I don't know if the system is getting, I don't know if it's getting better, per se, but I know that the system seems to be more aware that the same old thing isn't working and that it's time for a change. I think the system is ready to try new ways to help us. This is why I am here. A couple of years ago, parents didn't have a voice, let alone be able to sit on the panel like this. So I think the system is beginning to change for the better. The day of parents in classes that don't involve interacting with children in the class is over to me. I think they should be rid of. I went to Chances for Children, but if the judge didn't mandate me, I would have never known it existed. Right. So I think there should be more advertisements of these services, so this way parents can get the services before they enter the ACS system. Because I needed help, but I went to all those parenting classes and they didn't help me. I didn't know where else to go. So if I didn't have that bad problem, and then the judge mandated me, I would have never known that that place existed. I think in order to better the system, there needs to be more focus on what the parent thinks they need and easy access to services before they have a case. Thank you very much.
Right. Yeah. One of the recommendations in the report is you'd think is pretty simple. We need a way to track and identify the programs that do exist that are doing this kind of work, whether it's dyadic therapy or related work around skills building, true skills building between a child and a mom and a father. In a minute, we're going to take questions. If you could please put them on a piece of paper or on the note cards we handed out and pass them down to the aisles, and a couple of people will collect them and bring them down to me. So, Pia, you did the perfect transition there, because what I wanted to ask you all next is, so imagine a couple of months from now, if Bill de Blasio is mayor in City Hall after all his advocacy for early childhood education and after school programs and so on. What would you say to him? You know, he calls you in for advice. I think Pia just gave some of that advice. Do you have, first, let's start with Pia. Do you have a little more you would want to say to him, and then let's hear from the rest of you?
A little more about exactly what, though, like the school system, or?
About schools, about what you've seen in your life that relates to the way government works with families, with children.
Well, I think that well, with me personally, I'm having an issue now with my son. I think that we need to just be able to stop saying budget, budget, budget. If the child needs a different classroom or something, give the child a different classroom. Right. Because I keep hearing now that I'm interacting more with my child's school system and the Board of Education that we know that your son needs these services, but there just simply isn't enough money to put this service in your son's class. Right. So, I mean, how could you tell us that we know you need the help, but we just don't have the money? So then I'm left, you know, to try to help my son, but I can't because I don't have the things that I need. Right. Because there isn't enough money. So just, I guess, make some more things available. Right. Not so hard
close
to
to
get
home,
them.
right? Linda.
I think this is going to be a good assignment I'll take on with my entire agency,
Right.
which is to prepare the letter to Bill de Blasio. But I would probably say to him, let's focus on the areas of potential and really look at the importance of these young children to the future vibrancy of the city. And we're not talking long-term future. We're talking short-term future vibrancy of the city. So if we want a strong economy, we want a strong city, it is a logical place to invest. And I would also suggest that silos cost a lot of money.
Right.
And so that we really look at building bridges between these systems, and that there would be costs, savings there, because we already pay for a lot of these issues. We just pay for them after the problems have emerged. So it's not that there aren't dollars. We really need to take a good look at where the dollars are.
Right, right. Susan?
I guess I would say we have to build supports for vulnerable young children and family in every single place that they show up. This is the responsibility of every system that families interact with. We have had really, really good success co-locating infant mental health practitioners in primary pediatric care clinics. Pediatricians are a natural place to be alert for concerns about children and families. Child care centers and early childhood programs have to be a port of entry for support services for families. These are the places families are anyway. Foster care agencies, the family courts, everybody has to have a focus on supporting vulnerable children. Family courts have enormous power in directing service plans and need to have good partners to work with. So I think every system has to be infused with an opportunity to recognize and then do something for children and families who are vulnerable. Right. I think it's not the responsibility, as we've said about a lot of things of any one system, but of everybody to be aware of how young children can get some support and their families as well. Right. It has to be just built in everywhere.
Benita?
Whoever becomes mayor next, yep. I would like them to keep working toward what we are all concerned about in terms of strengthening programs that support families and have good outcomes for children, and also, continue to the conversation or discourse that's been started or is in everyone's mind around how do we strengthen partnerships across agencies and shared resources.
Right, right. I think, reality is, it may well be Joe Lhota, it may not be de Blasio. The reason I bring it up is because he's talked so much about early childhood education that it seems like there's an opening there, but we shall see. I want to get to some of the questions from the audience. Here's the first one. Many child care centers are ill-equipped to provide services to children and with therapeutic needs. How can we provide support for these centers? Anybody? It's a tough one. Jack.
Well, we could start by deciding that that's an important thing for us to do. Until you decide that's important to do, it's hard to know how to do it. And I think a strong case could be made for that. I hate to sound like Johnny One Note, but for me, I think what's really important is to make it safe for people to try new things. So to try new strategies. And this is where I don't think most of this is something that the public sector is going to be able to afford anyway. So there has to be a public-private sector kind of investment together in this. And God, New York's about as good a place as you can find where there's a private sector that has the resources and a fair amount of people in that private sector who care about these things. But the private sector is much more interested in trying new things in a good way and making it safe for people to try new things. It's not safe to try new things in this system. And so all of us have been socialized to collect data to show that we're making a difference rather than to collect data to find out whether what we're doing is making a difference. And that's an adaptive, but going back to your first comment, that's very sane to kind of just collect data to show you're making a difference. But I think what has to happen, whether it's child care centers responding to mental health problems or whatever, is we have to try some new things. We can't just say, we need to provide mental health consultation to every child center when we don't have the resources to do it, or we need to make sure that everybody's trained to do that. We need to do all of that better, but I think we need some new ideas, and it's not safe to try new ideas unless the system protects you if what you tried didn't work. That's kind of, as long as you learn from it, that's how you get better.
Right. Here's another one. Being involved in the child welfare system itself can be traumatic, or is a traumatic experience beyond the prior trauma of the reason for being in care in the first place. what is the best means to address this? You know, the trauma of removal, the trauma of transfers from foster parent to foster parent, all these different little traumas that mount up to something very large. Anybody want to comment? Pia?
For my own self, with my son, when he was removed from me and he came back home, what we did, it was a lot of mommy and me time, like a lot of love and just paying attention to him. Because even when I would like drop him off to like do errands and stuff, like he would have whoever it was call me like a lot of times, like, are you coming back? And what time are you coming back?
Right.
So just like you have to look at those people, us, with like a microscope and really get in there with us to help us.
Right.
Like I don't know, like delicately. Those children need to be handled delicately, but also with strength. I don't really know the right words, but delicately, with care, but like strength, with strength as well. To like give them like a feeling of support, backbone, because you're being bounced around different homes and stuff. You don't feel support. He's always, even in school still, he's acting up. He wants me to be with him all the time. So they have separation anxiety.
Right. Susan?
I can say a little bit more. You know, obviously we want to try to prevent removals of children from their parents. Once we get on that course, which sometimes we have to, but it takes on a life of its own, and it certainly compounds the stressors. So I think whatever we can do to identify those families that need support as early as possible, even if we're dealing with prenatal clinics or wherever it takes to identify families and build support as the parent is transitioning into parenting, because we want to keep kids home with their parents. Parents have the strongest emotional commitment to their children over the longest time. But we need to identify those families who will run into trouble. And I think we need to reframe how we think of biological parents who become known to the child welfare system. We focus a lot on their mental health and their substance abuse problems, but there's very little appreciation for the traumatic histories that lead them to substance abuse and mental health problems. So when we see a person as having a mental health problem or a substance use problem, they become in some ways the adversary to their own child, or sometimes even the dangerous adversary, instead of having a more informed and empathic understanding of what got a parent to the point of using drugs or becoming seriously depressed. And addressing those traumatic issues, and the fact that even if you get mental health treatment or substance abuse treatment, that doesn't mean you're going to have better parenting skills if you've come from a history where you've had a lot of neglect and abuse yourself. So we need to be seeing beyond the mental health and substance abuse problems to the life experiences that brought a parent to the point we are now, and trying to remediate those issues, work intensive, understand the complex needs, and provide really intensive supports for families so they can keep their kids home with them.
So early support is so critical long before a family reaches the crisis where Child Protective Services is involved. Right? One of the things, Susan, I've heard you spoke with me about the other day was this misidentification of trauma, and how common that is in so many systems. People working with these with parents don't necessarily see trauma for what it is. You know, can you say a little bit about how that might be changeable?
Well, I think it's changing. I think that we're becoming a much more trauma-informed city. I think every system that I interface with has some kind of trauma training going on. You know, again, we have to understand, why does a parent have problems with affect regulation? You know, why is a parent getting very easily set off when things are even minor frustrations? They often go back to very, very difficult circumstances that have made things very hard for parents to cope with. Right. You know, again, we spend a lot of money on foster care, and we can reapply that money to developing supports for families before children get removed. I know ACS is definitely moving in that direction, but we know what the risk factors are. As Dr. Shonkoff said, we know what the adverse childhood experiences are that result in problems for parents. We can identify those earlier than we have, and build supports for families who we know have those kinds of histories.
Right. Here's a related question. Are the courts being educated about the need for programs that work rather than ordering mental health evaluations on parents?
I would say that particularly with the Child Success NYC demonstration project, we have made an intentional effort to educate our family court judges about the promise of the model and how it can impact families who come before them, so that we reduce lengths of stay in foster care, aftercare services are provided, connecting families to our preventive services network, as well as maintaining placement stability by supporting foster parents while children are in care, so that they are preparing the child and the family as a support system to transition back home. So I do think that we're doing lots of work to educate both our family court legal services attorneys about the models, as well as the judges who hear the cases.
Right.
And our infant mental health programs are doing a lot with our family courts. 2 of our boroughs now have very sustained partnerships between the courts and infant mental health practitioners. We have a strong connection in our Bronx Family Court, and the Jewish Board now has a collaboration in the Manhattan Family Court. So I think the courts are beginning to partner with infant mental health and child development specialists to look at infants through a more interdisciplinary eye.
Right. That's great. Pia?
And I also think that children that have trauma that are returned home to their parents, I think that there should be some type of in-home therapy as well to help them interact inside the home.
Right. Interesting. There's a question, this is a challenge. Do parental visits exacerbate attachment disorders? In other words, can kids attach healthily to more than one set of parents? How can this be done more smoothly?
I'll take that.
It's a tough one.
Well, children can attach to more than one caregiver. And if we are working toward reunification, we have to be really sure that children have the opportunity to become attached to their biological parents. That means very, very frequent visits for very young children. A visit every other week when you're an infant is not going to help you develop any memory of that parent. They'll be a stranger every time the 2 weeks rolls around. Parents of very young children have to see their children several times a week in order for that relationship to become a foundation for reunification. And in terms of how stressful visits are very stressful. Visits involve a separation and reunion as many times as the visit occurs. Parents and children can re-trigger each other's memories of the bad things that happen. And it's very, very hard. Visiting is not the normal state of affairs between parents and children. You're not used to saying goodbye to your child after an hour visit. So we need a lot of support for visits. Children do have a lot of explosive and regressive behavior. It's just because they're very, very distressed. It's very emotionally laden for children. And they don't have any other recourse other than to have disruptive behavior afterwards. Doesn't mean we should stop the visits. It means we need more support for the visits. We need somebody to help a parent see their visit through the child's eye and understand what the child needs from them in a visit. We help parents who come into visits with all kinds of anger and frustration and terribly hurt feelings, and bring those feelings into the visit with their 1-year-old or 2-year-old who can pick up the vibe about how distressed or upset a parent is or angry. And so we need to help parents with visits, talk to them before visits, help them with a visit, help them reevaluate a visit afterwards, and work toward visits that meet everybody's. Help a bio parent understand why a child has to call the foster parent mommy, which can be very, very upsetting, or help people understand visits through the children's eyes.
Right.
I think that can lower some of the stress of visits.
That's great. All right, so the last question is a sort of an action one and very practical. The question is, I run a large Head Start in Brooklyn and would like to institute interactive parenting skill building with our parents, similar to what Inwood House is doing. We're also part of a coalition of organizations across sectors, and we believe in strengthening adults for parenting and for employment. I'd like to see best practices to help this coalition, but most of all, how can organizations that aren't doing this do it? What are the first steps? How do they start? Anybody? Some quick advice before we wrap?
think
Linda?
just begin with the outreach. I mean, forums like this obviously help make people aware of things that are out there. And I don't think there's a one of us, despite however busy we are, who would not take the call of a provider who's trying to improve that practice. And, you know, we can always get creative about joint fundraising and, you know, approaching foundations together. But I think the first thing is making people aware throughout the city of where those pockets of promising practices are happening. And encouraging people to collaborate and reach out. Right. One of the things we did at Inwood House in an effort to look at the issue of building capacity across the foster care system when it came to working with teen parents was to partner in a demonstration project with Forestdale and Graham Windham, two of our larger foster care providers, so that we could share with them some of our most promising practices and strategies for working with this population. And we would also be learning from them at the same time some of their promising practices, and together we'd create some things that neither of us had. Right. And so we're just in the second year of that effort. But again, these are the ways in which we need to encourage across our sector really being able to collaborate and share those promising practices. The realities that we function under when it comes to funding have us competing more often than collaborating. And so we really have to, you know, work against that very natural tendency to preserve what we have and recognize that we're all trying to make a larger impact here, and that there's a higher calling than preserving our own grant.
Right. Jack?
I'll build on that. I mean, one of the things we learned really early when we were starting our Frontiers of Innovation work was that people who are working in programs and communities feel really isolated from opportunities to kind of just do some thinking with other people. And so I think when people want to know what the best practices are, it's a little dangerous to think that all you need to do is to have somebody tell you who has the best practice and say, oh, good, and we'll get that, and then we'll do it, because everything has to be customized to that program, those people, that community, those families. And so creating it's not just kids who need good relationships to develop healthy, and we all need them, right? And I think people who want to try new things need the support of other people who are trying new things or who have tried things that they might want to do, and have it be more than just like a meeting that somebody holds once a year, and to provide that kind of glue and that kind of networking. And your point about the competing for funds obviously is a huge problem, but this was one of the most exciting things we learned early on in working and bringing scientists together with people in community programs, is the hunger in community programs to kind of talk about ideas people had more than just on a one-shot basis. Right? So I think it's that networking support that's really important.
Benita?
Oh, I was going to say, as someone who's founded an organization, I think that one of the things I learned through the evolution of my work in doing that is building relationships with systems and clearly understanding how they function, and also being willing to be innovative even if you don't have the funding you think that you should have, to try to test new ideas. Because 10 years ago, Brooklyn Young Mothers Collective did not exist, and I did not have a platform to talk about how change could happen, but it did happen. And I think about my role now within ACS and how we're bringing to bear new and different thinking about our work every day. And while some of it is, you know, models cost money, but some of it is about shifting culture and developing the relationships that you talked about. But not only developing the relationship, but keeping focused on the relationship and nurturing it and checking in and making sure people stay committed to the idea of change.
Right. All right. It's a great spot to end it. I want to thank the staff who helped out with this, and tech and everybody else. And thank you for coming. Thanks to the panelists, most of all.